The UK has been grappling with a deeply disturbing phenomenon: the grooming and sexual abuse of young girls by organised gangs. This horrifying reality came to light in the early 2000s, with cases surfacing in towns like Rotherham, Rochdale and Telford. These cases revealed a terrifying pattern of abuse, often involving multiple perpetrators and countless victims. The stories were harrowing. Young, vulnerable girls, often from troubled backgrounds or in care, were targeted, groomed, and subjected to unimaginable sexual violence. The perpetrators, often operating as part of organized gangs, employed chillingly effective tactics. They would befriend their victims, offering them gifts, attention, and a false sense of belonging, things that these vulnerable girls desperately craved. Drugs and alcohol were often used to further manipulate and control them. Once trapped in this web of abuse, the girls were often passed around between gang members, their cries for help ignored or silenced. The cases that emerged in the early 2000s sent shockwaves through the UK. The sheer scale of the abuse, combined with the horrifying details that emerged, left the nation reeling. It forced us to confront a terrifying reality: that this form of organized abuse was happening right under our noses in towns and cities across the country. The victims, predominantly young girls from disadvantaged backgrounds, were often overlooked and ignored, their suffering brushed aside. The exposure of these cases sparked outrage and ignited a demand for answers. How could this have been allowed to happen? How could so many young lives be destroyed while those in positions of power seemed to turn a blind eye? The answer, it turned out, was complex and deeply troubling. A toxic mix of institutional failures, cultural sensitivities, and a systemic inability to protect the most vulnerable members of our society. The grooming gang scandal exposed a horrifying truth: that predators often operate with chilling calculation, employing methods designed to exploit vulnerabilities and silence their victims. Their tactics are as insidious as they are effective, often beginning with a show of kindness and understanding, a way to gain trust and lower defenses. They target young girls, often from disadvantaged backgrounds or in care, who may be lacking in self-esteem or seeking love and acceptance. These predators, often operating as part of organized groups, know exactly who to target and how to exploit their vulnerabilities. They offer gifts, money, drugs, or alcohol, showering their victims with attention and affection, creating a sense of indebtedness and dependence. They manipulate their victims, using threats and intimidation to maintain control, often threatening to harm the victim or their loved ones if they speak out. The victims, often isolated and lacking a support system, can easily become trapped in this web of abuse. They are made to believe that they are responsible for what is happening to them, that they are somehow complicit in their own abuse. This sense of guilt and shame makes it even harder for them to come forward, to seek help, to break free from the cycle of exploitation. The grooming process can be gradual, even subtle at first, making it harder to detect and even harder for the victims to recognize that they are being exploited. The perpetrators often operate in plain sight, their actions seemingly innocuous, their true intentions masked by a veneer of normalcy. This makes it even more crucial for us to understand their tactics, to be able to spot the warning signs, and to create an environment where victims feel safe to come forward and report abuse without fear of judgment or reprisal. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the grooming gang scandal is not just the horrific acts themselves, but the systemic failures that allowed them to occur and persist for so long. The police, social services, and other institutions tasked with protecting the vulnerable failed to do so, their inaction and apathy compounding the suffering of countless victims. Reports were ignored, cries for help were dismissed, and opportunities to intervene were missed, time and time again. The police, in many cases, failed to adequately investigate allegations, often dismissing them as the actions of troubled teens rather than recognizing the signs of organized abuse. There were allegations of police corruption, of officers turning a blind eye to the abuse in exchange for information or favors. Even when investigations were launched, They were often hampered by a lack of resources, expertise, and a genuine understanding of the dynamics of grooming and exploitation. Social services, too, were found wanting, failing to adequately protect children in their care, many of whom were already vulnerable due to their personal circumstances. There were instances of social workers ignoring warning signs, failing to act on reports of abuse, and even placing children in homes where they were at risk of exploitation. The reasons for these failures are complex and multifaceted, ranging from a lack of training and resources to a culture of silence and denial. This institutional betrayal had devastating consequences, not just for the victims and their families, but for society as a whole. It eroded public trust in those entrusted with protecting the most vulnerable, created a climate of fear and suspicion, and allowed the perpetrators to act with impunity. It highlighted a deep-seated failure to address issues of child sexual exploitation, a failure that continues to haunt us today. The grooming gang scandal exposed a dark underbelly of British society, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about the prevalence of child sexual exploitation and the systemic failures that allowed it to flourish. The scars of this scandal run deep, leaving countless victims grappling with the trauma of their abuse and a society struggling to come to terms with its complicity. The road to justice is long and arduous, but it begins with acknowledging the failures of the past and taking concrete steps to prevent such horrors from happening again. We must ensure that victims of abuse are listened to, believed, and supported. This means providing adequate funding for specialized support services, training professionals to identify and respond to signs of abuse, and creating a justice system that is both sensitive and responsive to the needs of victims. We need to challenge the attitudes and beliefs that allow child sexual exploitation to persist, tackling issues like misogyny, racism, and the normalization of sexual violence. This is not just a matter for law enforcement or social services. It is a societal issue that demands a collective response. We must work together to create a culture of safeguarding, where children are taught about healthy relationships and consent, where they feel empowered to speak out against abuse, and where adults are vigilant in protecting them from harm. The journey towards healing and justice will be long and difficult, but we must remain steadfast in our commitment to protecting the most vulnerable members of our society. We cannot afford to let history repeat itself. We must learn from the mistakes of the past and work tirelessly to create a future where all children are safe from exploitation and abuse.